4 men pushed through the door of Rosalind's table on a Tuesday morning, and they walked past every table in the place, every booth, every stool, everything worth breaking, and they stopped in front of the one thing in that diner nobody was ever supposed to touch. A wooden chair in the corner, empty for 14 years, wiped down every single morning by a woman who'd never once explained why. The first man kicked it over, and the sound the wood made when it split wasn't loud, but every person in that room heard it. Then the cast-iron skillet came off its hook above the grill and hit the tile floor like a church bell somebody had grabbed by the throat. And that's when the diner emptied. Chairs scraped, coffee spilled. Regulars who'd been eating breakfast in that room since the day it opened grabbed their coat and pushed out the side door without looking back. Because that's what people do when a morning stops being ordinary. Nobody stood up for her. The woman who owned the place came out from behind her counter anyway, gray hair tied low, hands and still wet from the sink moving slow, the way a woman moves when she's got all morning. She said one thing, just one. She asked them to set the chair back up and walk out, and she forgot the whole morning ever happened. The man in the pink shirt laughed at her. Then he put a hand on her shoulder and shoved. She went down onto that tile floor in her own diner, in her own apron, in front of the last few people still backing toward the door. And the waitress, 27 years old, 6 months pregnant, apron still tied, order pad still in her hand, she ran. She got 2 steps. That's when the man stopped her, looked straight down at what she was carrying, and said the cruelest thing anybody said in that diner all morning. "Stand still, sweetheart. You've got more to lose than she does." So she stood still, and she watched the woman who'd taken her and lying on that floor, and she couldn't get to her. That's when the bell above the front door rang. One man walked in out of the cold. Black wool coat, no ring, no watch. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He didn't reach for anything. He just stepped inside, let the door swing shut behind him, and stood there, and he took in that whole room in about 2 seconds. The chair, the skillet, the woman on the tile, the pregnant waitress frozen with a stranger's hand out in front of her face. 4 men, and not one of them turned around. Not one of them recognized him, and that was the mistake. Because there are rooms in Philadelphia where grown men lower their voices before they'll say his family name out loud, and not one of those 4 had ever been anywhere near a room like that. They'd walked into a diner in a dying town to lean on an old lady for a few $1,000s a month, and they'd done it in front of the only man in the state who could take everything they had before lunch. He'd made a promise, a long time ago, about the man he was never going to let himself become again. And standing in that doorway, he had exactly one choice: keep it, or pick back up the thing he'd sworn he'd put down for good. If you're the kind of person who believes the quiet ones are always the ones you should watch, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know. Share this with somebody who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you don't miss where this goes. Now, let's go back to that Tuesday morning, 90 seconds before those 4 men ever touched that door, and find out exactly what happened at Rosalind's table. The story had begun exactly 90 seconds earlier. It was 8:38, and Rosalind's table was still having the most ordinary Tuesday morning in the world. The smell of bacon clung to the air the way it had for 14 years, thick and warm and faintly sweet, the kind of smell regular customers caught from the parking lot before they even opened the door. The little radio sitting on top of the backup refrigerator was playing the weather report, a man's voice talking about a cold front that would sweep down from the lake by the weekend, and no one in the diner was truly listening. Terence Kovac stood at the grill with grease coating both hands, turning a batch of fried eggs with a motion he had repeated so many times that he no longer needed to look. He was 24 years old. He had a daughter who was 3 years old and was spending the morning with a babysitter across town, and this morning shift was the only thing paying for it. Olivia Vane carried a tray toward table number 7, 2 plates and a pot of coffee, and halfway between the counter and the table, she stopped for exactly 1 second because pain stabbed through her lower back the way it always did when she had been standing too long. She didn't put a hand on her belly. She simply shifted her weight onto her left leg, let out a short breath, and kept walking. The elderly woman at table number 7 asked how many months she had left. Olivia said 3, and the woman said something about her own daughter having given birth in March. And Olivia smiled the smile she had taught herself to wear over the past 6 months, the kind of smile that didn't have to be real to remain kind. Then the door opened. 4 men walked in at the same time, and the first thing that was wrong was that they didn't close the door behind them. The December cold poured into the diner like water breaking through a levee, and every head in the room lifted at once. And for those first 2 seconds, no one understood what was happening, because 4 men walking into a diner at 8:38 in the morning could simply have been 4 hungry men. Then the first man reached out and swept away the row of drinking glasses lined along the edge of the counter. It wasn't a blow. It was only a sweep of his arm, slow and almost lazy, the way someone might brush crumbs from a table. 12 glasses struck the tile floor at once and shattered, and that sound wasn't an act of violence, it was a declaration. It said that from this second forward, this room belonged to someone else. The second man walked along the row of tables on the left and overturned 2 tables that still held the customers' food. Eggs, potatoes, and 2 cups of coffee that hadn't been finished all crashed onto the floor with the plates. The 2 customers sitting there jumped to their feet and backed away, and he didn't even look at them. He didn't look at anyone. He simply flipped the table, moved on, and flipped another. The third man went straight to the wall behind the counter, where the business license hung inside a cheap plastic frame, the same frame Rosalind had placed there on the day she opened the diner, and he tore it down, ripped the paper from the frame, and let it fall onto the tile floor, wet with spilled coffee. Of the 3 things they had done, that was the worst, even though it hadn't broken anything. The first 2 had been the destruction of property. This was a statement that the diner had no right to exist unless they allowed it. The 4th man did nothing at all. He wore a pink shirt made from the kind of fabric no one in Coldwater Bend ever wore, and he stood just inside the doorway for a long moment, as though he were waiting for his eyes to adjust to the light. Then he walked around the diner, slowly. He ran one hand over the surface of a table, then another, and then he stopped beside the window and tapped 2 fingers against the wooden frame, like a man inspecting a house he intended to buy. He looked up at the ceiling. He looked down at the floor. He even glanced toward the kitchen, where Terry Kovach was still standing with the spatula in his hand, not moving, because Terry Kovach was 24 years old and had a daughter who was 3, and he knew exactly what was happening, and he knew exactly that there was nothing he could do. Then the man in the pink shirt turned back toward the counter, where Rosalind Hartnett and I stood with both hands resting flat against the wood, and he smiled. He said his name was Frederick Pell, though she already knew that, because he had handed her his business card 6 days earlier. He said he was sorry about the mess. That was the exact word he used, mess. The word people used when they spilled a soft drink. Then he explained, in the voice of an insurance salesman describing the terms of a policy, that the commercial district was entering a period of transition, that businesses participating in the neighborhood development program would be guaranteed continuity of operations, and that the required contribution for an establishment of her size was $3,000 a month. He never raised his voice. He never made a threat. That was precisely what sent the cold crawling down a person's spine, because has demanded was a man trying to persuade, and Frederick Pell didn't need to persuade anyone. He finished speaking, then stood there waiting, his head tilted slightly to one side, friendly, and while he waited, his eyes wandered across the room once more, over the counter, past the kitchen, across the overturned tables. Then his gaze stopped at the corner of the diner. There, beneath the window and far from everything else, stood a single wooden chair. There was no table in front of it. No one was sitting in it. Its wood had been polished clean, in the way only something wiped down every day, for many years could ever be polished, while everything else in the diner was merely clean enough. Frederick Pell looked at that chair longer than he needed to. Then he looked at Rosalind, and for exactly 1/10 of a second, before she had time to hide it, he saw what he needed to see on her face. His smile didn't grow wider. It simply remained still. Then he turned his head toward the first man, who was still standing beside the broken glasses, and tipped his chin toward the corner. 4 seconds. That was how much time passed from the moment the door closed behind the man in the black wool coat to the moment anyone in the diner remembered what they were supposed to do. 4 seconds during which he didn't take another step. He simply stood there, just inside the doorway, his arms hanging loosely at his sides, and watched. The first man was the one who broke the silence. He was still holding the wooden club he had used to knock over the chair, and when he turned, he saw a man standing perfectly still in the middle of the diner he had just taken over, saying nothing, fearing nothing, and to a man like him, that silence was a question that had to be answered immediately. He swung the club. It was a good swing. It came across sideways, aimed at the place between the temple and the ear, the kind of blow meant not as a warning, but as an ending. The man in the black wool coat didn't move away. He stepped in. That was the part no one in that room could understand. Not then, and not even many years later. He stepped straight inside the arc of the swing, close enough that the club hadn't yet gathered its full speed, and it struck his shoulder instead of his head. There was a dull thud. He didn't move. His right hand rose. It closed around the other man's wrist. That was all. No twisting, no breaking, no dramatic motion of any kind. Just one hand closing around one wrist and holding it exactly where it was, and the man with the club pulled once, then pulled again. And then he realized his arm wasn't going anywhere, and something on his face shifted from aggression to confusion, and then into something far worse than either one. The man in the black wool coat opened his mouth. His voice was ordinary, no louder than the radio that was still giving the weather report. He said she was pregnant and told him to lower his voice. Then he let go. That was that part that frightened the man most. Had he struck him, the man would have understood where he stood, but he only released him, stepped back half a pace, and left the club in his hand, and the man didn't dare swing it a second time. He backed into the space between the two overturned tables and stood there, and the club in his hand suddenly became something he no longer knew where to put. The man in the black wool coat walked over to Rosalind. She was still lying on her side on the tile floor, one hand braced beneath her, trying to push herself up and failing, while a wide stain of coffee had spread across her apron. He didn't bend down to help her to her feet. He knelt, both knees on the wet tile among the shards of broken glass, wearing clothes that cost more than an entire week of the diner's revenue, and he knelt there until he was level with her eyes before he touched her. He asked where she was hurt. She didn't answer. She only looked at his face. Then he slipped one arm beneath hers and helped her sit up, slowly, little by little, and she allowed him to do it. Olivia stood 3 steps away. The hand of the man who had blocked her earlier had fallen back to his side, and there was nothing stopping her anymore. But she still didn't move, because she had just seen Fis for the first time in 7 months. She took 1 step backward. It wasn't a decision. It was only her body doing what her body wanted to do, and her hand settled over her belly with the instinct every pregnant woman seemed to have, though no one had ever taught it to them. He saw it. He saw her, and he saw her belly, and he saw the hand resting over it. His face didn't change. Not a single muscle moved. He only turned away and rose to his feet. As he passed the kitchen, he stopped, bent down, picked up the cast iron silly lying on the tile where it had fallen, and hung it back on the hook above the stove. He did it without saying a word, without looking at anyone, the way a person might set something upright after it had been knocked down in his own home. Then he stood there for 1 second, with his hand still resting on the skillet's handle. Rosalind Hartnett, sitting on the tile floor of her own diner, stared at him. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She only looked at the hook and the skillet and the hand resting on it, and something passed across her face that no one in the room could read. Frederick Pell cleared his throat. He had a line ready. He was the kind of man who always had a line ready, and it was supposed to be just insolent enough. The sort of remark that would let him take back control of the room without having to fight, because he had used it dozens of times in dozens of businesses along this road. He opened his mouth. Then he looked more closely at the face of the man in the black wool coat, and Frederick Pell, 33 years old, standing in the middle of a diner he had apart in less than 2 minutes, forgot what he had been about to say. The man in the black wool coat released the skillet handle and turned around. He didn't walk toward Frederick Pell. He simply remained where he was beside the stove and spoke to him across 16 feet, in the tone someone might use to ask after the health of an old acquaintance. How's his name first? Frederick Pell. Then he said the name of his company, and the name of the co-owner listed on the paperwork, and he stated the value of the asset Pell, and Lotlock had declared in their filing with the state $42 million, then paused for half a second, and gave the actual amount of cash sitting in his operating account that morning, less than $200,000. He said that 3 of his 4 active contracts were tied to loading operations at Pier Number 9, and that if the operating permit at that pier were suspended, all 3 contracts would breach their scheduling clauses in less than 24 hours, and that if all 3 fell into default at the same time, his lender would have the right to call the loans immediately. He said all of it in that same ordinary voice, emphasizing nothing, almost kindly, the way a doctor might read test results to a man who didn't yet know he was sick. Frederick Pell laughed. The laugh lasted exactly until the man in the black wool coat pulled a phone from his pocket. He tapped a name in his contacts. He raised the phone to his ear. Someone answered immediately, before a second ring. He said 3 words. Pier Number 9, stop. Then he lowered the phone. The entire call lasted 11 seconds. No one in that diner understood exactly what had just happened, but all of them felt it. The way people feel the pressure in a room change when someone opens a door on the floor below. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. He said that by dinner, Pell would be insolvent. Then he added one more sentence, and it was the only sentence that morning in which his voice carried something beneath the surface, though it still wasn't louder than the radio. He said that was what happened when a man shoved a woman to the floor. The color drained from Frederick Pell's face in waves, not all at once. He stood there, and anyone watching could see him calculating, searching for the leverage he had always found in every room he had ever entered, and for the first time in his life, there was none. He took 1 step backward toward the door. Then he stopped, and he said the one thing he never should have said. He said Mrs. Ward told him you would never come all the way out here. The room went silent. The man in the black wool coat didn't move. He didn't ask him to repeat it. He didn't turn his head. He simply stood there, and for those exact 3 seconds, the only thing moving in the entire diner was the steam rising from the burned eggs on the stove that Terry Kovach had forgotten to turn off long ago. Frederick Pell understood immediately, in the way a man understands that he has just said something he can't take back, and he turned and headed for the door faster than he meant to. The other 3 followed. The first man was still holding the wooden club, and he carried it with him as though he had forgotten it was in his hand. The last to leave was the oldest of the 4, a gray-haired man who had taken almost no part in anything that morning and wore a faded baseball cap, and at the threshold he stopped. He turned his head. He didn't look at the man in the black wool coat. He looked at the silver-haired woman sitting on the tile floor among the broken glasses. He looked at her for a long time, far longer than one stranger had any right to look at another, and there was something on his face that looked very much like he was trying to remember something. Then he left. The door closed. The bell above it gave one lonely chime in the room where no one else remained. There were only 4 people left. Terry Kovach stood in the kitchen with the spatula still in his hand. Olivia Vane stood in the middle of the diner, with her order pad clenched so tightly in her fist that her knuckles had gone white. The silver-haired woman sat on the floor, and the man in the black wool coat stood beside the stove, the hook where the skillet hung, around. And for the first time that entire morning he looked directly at her. And not a passing glance, not a look meant to assess the situation. He looked into her face, and she looked back at him. 14 years. She didn't cry, she didn't reach out, she didn't call his name. She only lowered her eyes to the clock on the wall, then looked back at him. And in the hoarse voice that 14 years of coffee and kitchen smoke had made even rougher, she told him to sit down because he hadn't eaten anything. To understand why an old woman sitting on a tile floor among shattered glasses would tell a man like that to sit down and eat something, we have to go back 14 years. Coldwater Bend lies in eastern Pennsylvania, 2 hours from Philadelphia by car when the roads are clear, and it was once a town with a reason to exist. That reason was a steel mill at the end of Main Street, and it had fed 3 generations of men living in 2-story houses along both sides of the road, and then one morning it stopped feeding anyone. They didn't tear the mill down. They simply locked the gates and left. Now Coldwater Bend has a pawn shop, 2 churches that take turns opening on Sundays, because neither one has enough people left to stay open all month, a gas station, and a diner. That diner opens at 5:30 in the morning, not 6. Not 5:30 for appearances, only to begin truly serving at 7. At 5:30 the lights come on, the coffee begins to flow, the grease heats on the stove, and the door opens every day for 14 years. The woman who bought it paid in cash. The whole town knew that much because the seller couldn't keep his mouth shut. But no one in town knew where the money had come from, and after about the third year, no one thought it was worth asking anymore. She named the place Rosalind's Table, and Rosalind was her name, Rosalind Hartnett, though people called her Roz because 3 syllables were too many for a small town. Silver hair, always tied low at the nape of her neck, a rough voice in the way only years of kitchen smoke could make a voice rough. She wore no ring. There were old photographs on the wall, behind the counter, but no wedding picture, and in 14 years, not one person in town ever heard her mention a husband, though everyone assumed there had been one, because women didn't simply appear at the age of 47, with a bag of cash and no story at all. There were 2 things in that diner every regular knew not to touch. The first was the wooden chair in the corner beneath the window, with no table and no one sitting in it, always wiped down before the coffee was even brewed. During the first year, a new customer would sometimes pull it out to make room for one more person, and Roz would walk over, not angry, offering no explanation, and say the seat was taken. That was all. The seat was taken. People would look around the empty room and then look back at her, and she wouldn't say anything else, and after a while, they would leave it alone. 14 years, and not one person in that town ever asked her a second question. The second was the cast iron skillet hanging from the hook above the stove. It was heavy, black, far older than the diner itself, and along the handle was an inscription worn nearly smooth that a person had to tilt beneath the light to read. 4 words that said, "Eat first, talk later." It was never used for cooking. Terence Kovach had asked to use it 3 times during his years working there, and each time he had a good reason: a large batch of eggs, another skillet broken, and all 3 times Roz shook her head and offered no explanation. Terry was 24. His wife had left when their daughter was only 14 months old, and he had gone to 7 places in town looking for work with a blank employment record, and all 7 had said no, and Roz Hartnett looked at him for exactly 4 seconds before asking whether he knew how to crack an egg. His daughter's name was Sonia. She was 3 years old. On Saturday mornings, she sat at the counter coloring while her father cooked, and everyone in the diner accepted her as part of Saturday morning, no different from the coffee or the weather report. Sonia called Olivia Miss Belly. No one corrected her. In a town like that, a place that opened at 5:30 every morning wasn't a business. It was a promise someone was keeping. The trouble was that no one in Coldwater Bend knew what the promise was, who it had been made to, or why a woman needed to turn on the lights at an hour when the entire was still asleep. Every day, with such unfailing regularity that if the lights failed to come on morning, half the town would probably know, without being told, that she had died. They only knew that the coffee was always hot, that she never asked a question they didn't want to answer, that there was an empty chair in the corner she wiped every morning with the cleanest cloth in the diner, and that on certain evenings when she closed late and was alone inside, she would stand for a very long time before that corner, before turning off the lights. 6 months before that Tuesday morning, at 4 o'clock in the morning, Rosalind Hartnett came down the stairs behind the diner the way she always did, and saw someone standing outside the glass door. A young woman. No luggage, not even a purse. Her shoes were soaked through as though she had crossed the parking lot more than once, and the coat she wore was so thin that it was no longer clothing at all, only something someone had grabbed in a hurry. She didn't knock. She simply stood there beyond the circle of light, cast by the porch lamp, both hands in her coat pockets, staring inside. Rosalind unlocked the door. She opened it. She didn't say anything. The young woman didn't say anything either. Rosalind turned back as I switched on the coffee machine, and during the 4 minutes it took to run, the 2 women stood in the same room without either one opening her mouth. Then Rosalind set a cup of coffee on the counter and pushed it forward a little over an inch. The young woman sat down. She drank. Her hands trembled so badly that the cup rattled against the saucer, and Rosalind turned away to get the sugar so she wouldn't have to be watched. When she had finished, Rosalind took an apron from the hook behind the kitchen door and placed it on the counter in front of her. Then she set a key beside it. The key to the small room upstairs where she usually stored dry goods. She didn't ask the young woman her name. She didn't ask where she had come from. She didn't ask what she was running from, what's done to her, whether anyone was looking for her, whether anyone was waiting for her, and most importantly, She didn't ask why a 27-year-old woman was standing outside the glass of a diner in a dying town at 4 o'clock in the morning, with nothing in her hands. Olivia Vane waited 3 days for that question. Each night, she lay on the folding bed upstairs and prepared an answer, 3 different versions of it, and she waited. On the 4th day, she understood that the question was never going to come, and that was the first night she slept for more than 4 hours. She was good at the work, strangely good. By the 2nd week, Terry Kovich noticed that she never used the register to add anything, that she could hold 14 checks from 14 different tables in her head at the same time, taxes, tips, change, and never miss by so much as a penny. He asked whether she had been an accountant or something before. She said she had once done something involving numbers. Terry laughed, and he didn't ask again, because that was the unspoken rule of the diner, and he had been living by it for 3 years. She hid the pregnancy until the 4th month. She wore oversized cook's jackets, turned her body sideways when she spoke to people, ate very little in front of others, and ate heavily at midnight. Rosalind knew from the 1st week. She didn't say a word for 3 months. Then, one afternoon in September, Olivia had to sit down in the middle of her shift because she felt dizzy, and Rosalind handed her a glass of water, and Olivia said it bluntly, almost aggressively, the way people confessed when they had already prepared themselves to be thrown out. Rosalind asked her exactly one question. She asked whether Olivia wanted to keep the baby. Olivia nodded. Rosalind nodded back. Then she stood up and went to wipe the counter, and the matter ended there. During the first 3 months, Olivia didn't see a doctor even once. She had no insurance. She had no official employment from the previous 7 years that she dared put on any form, and a single ultrasound at the nearest private clinic cost $280. Then one day, Rosalind handed her an appointment slip for a clinic in Allentown and said it was part of a state program for low-income workers, that she had called to ask about it. Olivia went. She went 4 times in 4 months. She never had to pay a thing, and for 6 months she believed that story. 6 days before that Tuesday morning, a man in a pink shirt walked into the diner at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, ordered a cup of coffee he never drank, and explained very pleasantly that there was a commercial district restoration program. He placed a business card on the counter. Rosalind listened to everything he had to say. Then she gave him one word, no. The entire diner went silent, all 7 customers who were there that day, and no one understood why that single word carried so much weight. Frederick Pell smiled, said he would stop by again, and left. That evening, Olivia wiped tables beside Rosalind and said perhaps they should simply pay it, that $3,000 wasn't worth anyone getting hurt. Rosalind wiped the counter in slow circles and said she had paid that kind of fee for 20 years, child, and it never stopped with money. What she didn't tell Olivia was that she had recognized the name on Frederick Pell's business card a week before he ever walked through the door, and she knew exactly who was behind it. She had only hoped she was wrong, now to Philadelphia, because there was a third person in this story, and by that Tuesday morning, he had spent 6 months searching for never once had admitted to anyone he was looking for. The name Fiore in Philadelphia wasn't the sort of thing people saw in movies. There was no Italian restaurant with checkered tablecloths. It was concrete cranes, construction subcontracting agreements, dock workers' unions, and fleets of trucks running through the night along the East Coast. It was infrastructure. Had someone driven through the heart of that city on any afternoon in the past 30 years, they would have passed at least 4 things that family name had touched, and they wouldn't have known it. The man who built it was named Wendell Fiore, and it took him 30 years to do so. He had 3 rules, and he repeated them often enough that the men who worked for him could recite them from memory. Don't touch women, don't touch children, don't sell anything that kills people. In 30 years, he never broke a single one of those rules, and that made him rare in a way that caused people to respect him, while also thinking him slightly foolish. He died on a Thursday evening at the age of 55 while washing dishes. There was no gun, no drama. No one stepping out of the shadows. He stood at the sink in his own kitchen with a plate in his hand when a stroke passed through his brain, and the plate shattered on the tile floor, and by the time anyone arrived, they were already 30 minutes too late. His son's name was Liam. He was 23 when he inherited everything. He wasn't like his father in any way that mattered. Wendell ruled through honor, through handshakes, through remembering the names of the wives and children of every man who worked for him. Liam ruled through accounting. Over 14 years, he moved roughly 70% of the family's operations into legitimate business, not because of morality, but because he sat down with a spreadsheet and realized that clean money moved faster, traveled farther, and never required anyone to keep quiet. He had never pulled a trigger once in his life. He didn't need to. His men called him Mr. Ice behind his back, and they began calling him that after the morning he fired a warehouse manager who had worked for the family for 22 years, a man whose daughter Wendell had once stood as godfather for. Through an email sent at 6:04 in the morning, 3 sentences, not one word of thanks, and by 7 o'clock the man's access card no longer opened the gate. No one was beaten, no one was threatened. That was precisely what frightened people. One woman had stood beside all of it for 20 years. Her name was Constance Ward, 58 years old, an advisor, and she had been part of the organization since Wendell was alive. She knew every number, every name, every matter the police had never asked about. She had been present at every important meeting of the past 14 years. She had simply never sat at the table. She stood behind them, beside the door, holding the files, and when the meeting ended, she was the one who turned off the lights. No one had ever thought of that as an insult. It was simply where she belonged. Liam's wound, however, was older than all of it. 2 weeks after his father's funeral, his mother disappeared. No note. She took very little, and she left behind a great deal, including things no one would ever leave if they intended to return. He searched for her for 12 years. He had everything a person could need to find someone: money, men, connections in places the police couldn't reach, and he still couldn't find her. Then he stopped. He stopped because one evening, Constance Ward sat down across from him, placed her hand over his, and told him that his mother didn't want to be found, and that respecting that wish was the only gift he could still give her. Liam Fiore, having spent over a decade consumed by the search, finally nodded, and he stopped looking. This was the first lie Constance Ward had ever told him. She had known exactly where Rosalind Fiore was for all 14 years. She had only been saving that knowledge for later. 8 months before that Tuesday morning, it was raining in Philadelphia. There had been a funeral that afternoon. A man of 60, who had worked for the family for 31 years, had died of lung cancer, and Liam Fiore had stood in the cemetery for exactly 20 minutes, shaken precisely as many hands as needed shaking, and returned to his office at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. At 9 o'clock that night, he was still sitting there, and he hadn't turned on the lights. The entire floor had gone dark. The only illumination came from the orange glow of the street below, rising through the windows, while trails of rainwater running down the glass made the light seem to flow with them. Olivia Vane knocked on the door at 9:15 with a folder of documents. She was the internal auditor, and in that entire building, she was the only person permitted to see both sets of books, the set shown to outside auditors and the set that told the truth. And that meant she entered rooms where men who had worked there for 15 years still had to knock and wait. He didn't tell her to turn on the lights. She didn't turn them on either. She placed the folder on his desk and said it needed his signature, and he nodded, and she stood there waiting. He didn't sign it. He only sat looking out the goal. 1 minute passed, then 2. Anywhere else in that building, 2 minutes of silence with Liam Fiore would have been 2 minutes during which an ordinary person searched for a way to retreat. Olivia didn't retreat. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, and she looked out the window too, and the two of them sat in the darkness watching the rain like strangers aboard a slow-moving train. She sat there for perhaps 10 minutes. She heard the clock on the wall. She heard the coffee machine in the corner still warming a pot that had gone stale long ago. She heard him breathing, and she realized it wasn't even. Then she asked him the question no one in that building had dared to ask in 14 years. She asked whether he ever felt tired. He answered. That was the part no one had expected, including him. He spoke about his mother. He spoke about the kitchen table in the old house, and the chair where she had always sat at the head of it, on the side nearest the sink, and how that chair was still there in the empty house where no one lived anymore, though he continued paying the electric bill every month. He said he didn't know whether she was alive. He said it in his usual voice, and that was precisely what made it terrible. He said that, for 14 years, he hadn't known whether he was the son of a living woman or the son of a dead one, and that he had stopped searching not because he had accepted it, but because someone had told him that stopping was the only respectful thing to do, and he had believed her. At some point, without either of them noticing, the coffee on the desk went completely cold. The orange light continued flowing across the glass. Then the streetlights switched off at 6 o'clock in the morning, according to the city schedule, and the sky changed from black to gray, and Olivia Vane woke in a room filled with no light, and knew before she even opened her eyes that she was there alone. There was no note. There was nothing at all. The cold cup of coffee remained exactly where it had been on the desk. She understood what it was. She was 27 years old, and she wasn't a child, and she knew exactly what to call the thing a man did when he disappeared before dawn without leaving a single word. The next day, he spoke to her in the voice of an employer, no colder, no warmer. Exactly the same voice he had used the previous Tuesday. She nodded, handed him the documents, left the room, and worked for the next 8 hours without making a single error in a single number. People need to understand this about Olivia Vane. Her mother left when she was 7. Her father gambled away everything they had and died when she was 19, leaving her with a debt and a broken car. She studied accounting at community college in the evenings while working the day shift at a laundromat. And when she was 24, Fiore Holdings called her, and for the first time in her life, they paid her exactly what her mind was worth, and she accepted. 3 years, she knew exactly what she was signing every time she signed her name. No one had held a gun to her head. She had chosen. She told herself it had only been one night and that it hadn't meant anything. She was right about the first part. 1 month later, standing in the restroom of a gas station beside Interstate 76 at 2 o'clock in the morning, she would discover just how terribly wrong she had been about the second. 1 month after that rainy night, Olivia Vane noticed a line that didn't match. It was small. $14,000, a consulting payment from one subsidiary to a company whose name she had never heard before. And in the strictest accounting sense, it matched perfectly. The books balanced. There was an invoice. There was a project code. The only problem was that the project code belonged to a project that had closed 18 months earlier. It took her 3 weeks to trace it, and there was nothing interesting about the way she did it. It was only a woman sitting in front of a screen after working hours, peeling back one shell company after another, comparing dates against dates, until the shape of what lay beneath began to appear like a body, slowly rising through dark water. At 2 o'clock one Thursday morning, sitting alone in the server room in the basement with the fins humming in her ears, she saw the whole thing at once, and both her hands went physically cold. $41 million. Constance Ward had taken $41 million from the family's funds over 6 years. Not once, not 10 times, hundreds of times, never enough in any single transaction for an ordinary audit to notice, each one supported by paperwork, each one legitimate on the surface. And the money hadn't gone into her personal accounts. Not a single cent. She hadn't bought a house, hadn't bought a boat, hadn't hidden it anywhere. She had used it to purchase something else outright, a network, Pell and Locke, along with 2 more shell companies, all of them legal on paper, all of them licensed, all of them with their own accountants and attorneys. Constance Ward had been building a second organization inside Liam Fiore's organization, using his own money, directly beneath his feet for 6 years. Then Olivia saw the final part, the part that made her rise from her chair. Every expenditure made during those 6 years had been structured so that when traced backward, all of them led to one place. Not to Constance Ward, to Liam Fiore, every last dollar. She wasn't merely stealing. She was wrapping the entire $41 million into a neat package to place on the desk of a federal prosecutor, with his name written across the top, and when he was gone, his chair would be empty. Olivia copied everything onto a silver USB drive. She intended to give it to him. That was the only thing she thought about for the next 3 hours, and she sat in her car in the parking garage until 6 o'clock in the morning, waiting for the building to open. She went up to his floor. She walked to the door of his office, and she heard Constance Ward's voice inside. Constance was speaking to someone on the phone. She mentioned the auditor. She said the woman had begun asking the wrong questions. Olivia stood outside that door, with one hand still resting on the handle, and she waited to hear his voice. She waited 30 seconds. She heard nothing. That door was thick. She knew how thick it was. She had stood on the other side of it hundreds of times. and knew that a person outside couldn't hear anything at all, and there was no way for her to know whether he was in there, and that was precisely the problem. If he was inside, then he was listening, and if he was listening without saying anything, she was already dead. She couldn't take the risk. She turned away. She took the stairs instead of the elevator. She left her car in the garage because it could be tracked. She abandoned her apartment, her clothes, her computer, everything except the coat on her body and the USB drive in her pocket. And she walked 3 miles out of downtown before paying cash for an old car at a used car lot where no one asked questions. That night, at 2 o'clock in the morning, inside the restroom of a gas station beside Interstate 76, she watched 2 lines appear on a pregnancy test she had bought along with a bottle of water and a sandwich. She sat on the closed toilet lid for 40 minutes. Then she went back to the counter, bought a $4 sewing kit, returned to the restroom, and stitched the USB drive into the inner lining of her coat beneath her left arm, using the ugly tight stitches of someone who had never been taught how to sew. She didn't know where to go. Then she remembered something, in the old personnel records at Fior Holdings. Inside a paper filing cabinet no one had opened in years, there was a page that had been crossed out but could still be read, an address where Wendell Fiore had sent money every month for many years before suddenly stopping. There was no name, only an address. Coldwater Bend, Pennsylvania. She drove there because it was the last place in the world anyone would ever look for her. She had no idea that it was also the one place in the world she should never have gone. She drove for 6 hours. Not because Coldwater Bend was 6 hours away, but because she took detours, changed routes 3 times, stopped at 2 places where she had no reason to stop, doing the things frightened people did when they didn't know who they were running from. By nearly 4 o'clock in the morning, the fuel gauge had fallen below the red line, and she entered a town where not a single streetlight was still burning, and she pulled over in front of the only place that looked as though anyone might be there, a darkened diner with a faded wooden sign. She turned off the engine, and then Olivia Vane sat inside that car and cried for the first time in 6 months. It wasn't a beautiful kind of crying. She cried the way people cried when the body finally presented the bill for everything it had endured, both hands gripping the steering wheel, her forehead pressed against it, and she couldn't stop for 4 minutes. Then the lights inside the diner came on. At that same moment, Rosalind Hartnett was coming down the back stairs the way she had every morning at 4 o'clock for 14 years. She turned on the lights. She walked to the coffee machine. Then she turned and saw someone standing outside the glass door. 2 women running from the same dead man stood on opposite sides of a glass door at 4 o'clock in the morning, and each believed she was looking at a stranger. Rosalind didn't ask her a single question. Not because she was tactful, not because she was kind. 14 years earlier, there had been a morning when she herself stood on the other side of a door, exactly like that one. Wet, without luggage, without a plan, and she had stood there for a very long time, and no one had opened the door for her. That same morning, 2 hours away by car in Philadelphia, Liam Fiore received a report. Internal auditor Olivia Vane hadn't come to work for 3 days. Her car was still in the building's parking garage. Her apartment remained untouched, her clothes still in the closet, her computer still on the desk, the dishes still in the sink. There was no sign of a struggle. There was nothing at all. He wasn't angry. That was what made the man delivering the report tell his wife about it that evening. Because in 14 years he had never seen Liam Fiore respond to bad news with anything other than another question. This time he asked nothing. He stood up, walked to the window, and remained there with his back turned for a very long time. The man didn't recognize what it was at first. It took him months to understand. It was fear. Liam had people search for her. 6 months. He used channels the police didn't have. People money couldn't buy, but 30 years of relationships could. And he told everyone it was a security matter, that an auditor who knew too much had disappeared and that this was unacceptable. Everyone nodded. It was a perfect explanation. But there was one thing no one in that organization knew. 3 times a week, Liam Fiore drove himself somewhere, alone with no driver and no one beside him, usually late at night or early in the morning, and he drove to places where there was no business reason for him to go. He passed through towns where he had no work to do. He parked beside the road and sat there. He told no one where he went, and no one dared ask, and he did it 3 times a week for 26 consecutive weeks. Then, 1 week before that Tuesday morning, one of his men handed him a statement of unusual expenses belonging to Pell and Locke, a company he had begun watching for entirely different reasons. There was one line in that statement: Regional Development Fee, Cold Water Bend. He stared at the town's name far longer than it should have taken to read 4 words. Because he had seen it somewhere before. It took him half the night to remember where. In his father's notebook. He drove to Coldwater Bend on a Tuesday morning to look at a diner. In 14 years, he had never once driven anywhere merely to look at a diner. He told himself it was business. He arrived at 8 o'clock. He parked his car in the darkest corner of the lot, keeping his face hidden behind the frost-covered windshield, because he knew that any premature contact would alert Constance's watchers and put Olivia in immediate danger. For 40 agonizing minutes, he watched through the diner window the woman he had spent 6 months and a fortune trying to find, carrying his unborn child while working on her feet, and every protective instinct in his body screamed at him to step in. But he forced himself to wait outside in the cold until the threat was initiated, ready to move the second they touched the door. 9:10. Terry Kovac had locked the front door and turned the sign to closed, then stood in the kitchen without knowing what to do with his hands. The broken glass still lay scattered across the tile floor. No one swept it up. Rosalind Hartnett rose from the chair where someone had helped her sit, walked to the coffee machine, and made coffee. Her hands were trembling. Not much, but enough for the spoon to tap against the side of the cup, and she didn't try to hide it. She simply let them tremble and kept going. She took out 3 cups. She set them on the counter one by one, slowly, and the sound of porcelain touching wood 3 times in a completely silent room seemed louder than it had any right to be. 3 cups. Olivia stood there with the order pad still in her hand, staring at those 3 cups without understanding. Then her eyes lifted. On the wall behind the counter, among the old, yellowing photographs she had walked past 4 times a day for 6 months, there was a picture of a young man standing in front of a diner. Not this diner. A diner in the city, with traffic behind him and a neon sign above it. The man was smiling and holding a hat in one hand. Olivia had looked at that photograph hundreds of times and had never truly seen it. Now she did, Wenzelfior. She should have said no. Then she said it again. No. She backed away until her back struck a table. The man in the black wool coat turned to look at her, and he understood nothing, and he asked her a question in his ordinary voice. Though this time there was the faintest crack running through the middle of it, he asked whether she knew his mother, and Rosalind Hartnett, standing behind the counter with 3 cups of coffee before her, turned her head very slowly and asked what he had just said. No one spoke for 10 seconds. Then she set down the pot. She said she knew he was going to ask why. She said everyone thought they already knew the answer, including him, and everyone was wrong. She said she hadn't left because of his father. She hadn't left because of the funeral, because of that life, because of the things he had done that she knew about, and the things he had done that she hadn't wanted to know. 2 weeks after burying her husband, she had gone downstairs to the kitchen at midnight for a glass of water, and she had found him sitting at the kitchen table. 23 years old. There was a sheet of paper in front of him, and on that paper he was listing the names of people in the organization, and beside every name he had written a number, and she had stood in the doorway long enough to understand that the number represented the likelihood that each person would betray him first, and he was ranking them. She said she had stood there looking at his face. There was no anger on it, no grief. His father had been dead for only 14 days, and he was calculating, and his face looked exactly the way it had when he did his homework at 10 years old. She said she hadn't been afraid he would kill someone, Liam. She had been afraid he would do it without his face changing. She said she had taught him everything. How to speak to older people, how to shake hands, how to remember the names of the wives of the men who worked for him. She had taught him everything except one thing. She hadn't taught him how to grieve. And that night, standing in the kitchen doorway and watching her son arrange human beings into numbers, she had understood that it was no longer something she could teach him, and that if she stayed, she would spend the next 20 years pretending not to see it. She said she hadn't had the strength to do that one more time. He stood there without speaking for a very long time. Then he said he had searched for her for 12 years before he finally stopped. Rosalind nodded. She said she knew. She said, "I knew you searched for 12 long years, Liam. until Constance finally convinced you to stop. She said she had stood behind those curtains and watched his car pass through this town 3 times. No one in the diner breathed. Then she turned toward Olivia. She said, "And then there's you. You came to my door with my grandchild inside you, and I gave you a cup of coffee and never once asked who the father was." She said, "I'm old now. I'm not foolish anymore. I'm only tired." No one stepped forward. No one touched anyone. 3 people stood inside a diner filled with broken glass, with 3 cups of coffee slowly growing cold on the counter, and between them lay 14 years, 7 months, and something none of them had yet named. Then the telephone mounted on the wall behind the counter began to ring. The clock read 10:12. Rosalind picked up the receiver. She said hello. Then she said nothing more. She stood there listening, and within 4 seconds, all the color drained from her face, the kind of pallor that didn't belong to someone who was afraid, but to someone who had just recognized a truth she had known for a long time, and had prayed she was wrong about. She didn't ask who was calling. She only held out the receiver toward the man in the black wool coat without looking at him. He took it. He raised it to his ear, and the voice on the other end of the line was warm. That was the first thing anyone needed to understand about Constance Ward. She never spoke loudly. She never threatened anyone in a way that could be recorded and played back. She spoke to him like an aunt calling her nephew on his birthday. She said, "Hello, sweetheart, is your mother still making good coffee?" He didn't answer. She continued, pleasant and unhurried, saying that she had wondered how long it would take him to drive all the way out there, that she had guessed he never would, that she had been wrong, and that she didn't like being wrong. She had known. For all 14 years, she had known the exact town, the exact diner, the exact hour it opened. She had never touched the old woman. She had simply left her there, alive, breathing, turning on the lights at 4 o'clock every morning, like a chess piece placed on the board from the very first move, while the opponent remained unaware it even existed. Then she said she had filed the case that morning. She stated the amount, $41 million. She said every trail in the file led back to one name, and that name wasn't hers. She had approximately 9 days before the arrest warrant was signed, perhaps 10, depending on how busy the office happened to be that week. Then she said she could withdraw it. She said anything could be withdrawn when a person knew whom to call. She needed only one thing, the auditor, and the drive she had taken with her. He remained silent for a very long time. Then he said she had worked for his father for 20 years. There was a faint breath on the other end of the line, almost a laugh, and when she spoke again, her voice was just as warm as before, and that was precisely what made it more frightening than any scream could have been. She said, "Your father kept me standing behind a door for 20 years and called it respect. She said you did exactly the same thing. She said I was running this organization before you knew how to shave, Liam." Then she paused. "I was simply never allowed to sit down." She hung up. Liam Fayor stood there with the receiver still pressed to his ear, listening to the steady tone, and then he slowly lowered it. He turned around, and he saw the wooden chair. It was still lying on its side in the corner where it had fallen, one leg broken away, its polished wooden seat face down on the tile floor among the shattered glass. He looked at it for a very long time. He didn't know whose chair it was. He didn't know why it was there, why it remained empty, why a woman had wiped it clean every morning for 14 years. But he had just heard a 58-year-old woman deliver her final sentence in the voice of someone reciting a line she had memorized 20 years earlier, and he stood inside a ruined diner staring at a chair that had been kicked over, and something inside his mind clicked into place. He called his attorney. The call lasted 4 minutes. The case was real. It had been filed at 7:40 that morning with the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. The prosecutor handling it was an assistant United States attorney named Maribel Canero, and he said the name and people used when speaking about bad weather, because Maribel Quintero was the kind of person who never filed an indictment unless she was certain she would win. Liam listened to everything. He asked no further questions. Then his attorney added one more sentence, the sentence he had hesitated to say throughout the entire call. He said, "Liam, the file contains the digital signature of an internal auditor on every transaction, confirming every one of them, all $41 million. Liam asked whose signature it was, but he already knew the answer before it came. and he had to reach behind him for a chair so he could sit down that same morning at 10:30 in an office above an auto parts store on the north side of the city. Frederick Pell received 3 calls from the bank within 40 minutes. The first was from a loan officer asking whether there had been some kind of mistake. The second was from that officer's supervisor. The third wasn't a question. His operating permit at pier number 9 had been suspended, and when he finally looked at the timestamp on the electronic notice, he saw that it had been issued at 8:52 that morning, 47 minutes after a man inside a diner in a dying town had spoken 3 words into a telephone. He screamed, he slammed both hands down on the desk, and the monitor bounced upward and crashed back down, and no one in the room moved. He called Constance Ward. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. He called again, 6 more times. He called a 3rd time, and this time he didn't wait for finish ringing. He hurled the phone into the wall. In the corner of the room, an old man sat on a plastic chair with both hands resting on his knees, the faded baseball cap still on his head. Otto Brennan was 62 years old, and he had remained silent for the past 20 minutes. Then he opened his mouth. He asked only one question. He said, "The man sitting in the last booth. Describe him to me, not what he did. Him." Freddie turned around, still breathing hard, and said, "What are you talking about? He was just some guy in a black wool coat." Otto said nothing. Freddie continued irritably, saying there was nothing special about him. No ring, no watch, empty hands, no hurry, standing there as though the diner belonged to him. Otto Brennan let out a slow, heavy breath. He was already sitting, but he seemed to sink even deeper into the plastic chair, the way a person does when their legs suddenly no longer seem capable of supporting them. He removed his cap. He turned it twice in his hands and placed it on his knees. Then he said that 20 years earlier, he had worked at pier number 9, unloading cargo on the night shift for a man named Wendell Fiore. He said there had been one summer when a man on his crew cursed at the cashier in the pier cafeteria because she had given him the wrong change. He had only cursed at her. He hadn't touched anyone. The next day, the entire crew of 11 men was fired. The whole crew. Not only the man who had done it. It took Otto 5 months to find work again. He said he wasn't telling that story to boast that he had once worked for a decent man. He was telling it because Freddie needed to understand that the kind of man he had just provoked was the kind of man willing to destroy 11 families over one sentence spoken to a cashier. Then he said, "You just shoved Wendell Fiore's wife to the floor in front of his son. And the son is much worse than the old man ever was, because he has never once needed to be angry in order to do anything." The entire room went silent. Then Frederick Pell laughed. It wasn't a joyful laugh. It was the kind of laugh a man gave when he had nowhere left to go and needed to prove to the entire room that he still had one card left to play. He said, "You think I don't know that?" He said, "She's my aunt, Otto. Constance Ward is my mother's sister. Who do you think gave me the money?" No one said anything. The other 3 men in the room didn't even move, and thus lasted long enough for Freddie to realize what he had just done, and his face changed, but it was already too late. Otto Brennan sat perfectly still. He was putting everything together again. $3,000 a month from a diner in a town with nothing, 2 hours from the city, a diner whose entire monthly revenue probably wasn't worth one small Pell and Lock contract. It had never been about the money. It had never been an extortion scheme. Someone had wanted that diner torn apart. Someone had wanted that old woman knocked to the floor. And the 4 of them, including Otto, had only been the hammer. Otto stood up. He put his cap back on, adjusted it with 2 fingers out of a habit 40 years old, and walked toward the door. Freddie asked where he was going. Otto stopped at the threshold but didn't turn around. He said, "I'm 62 years old, Freddie. There aren't many chances left to choose a different side." He knew he had to reach the diner before the storm hit, and after delivering his warning, he would be the one driving back to Philadelphia, right alongside Liam and Olivia, and ensuring they wouldn't walk into the trap alone. Then he went down the stairs and climbed into his car, and didn't drive to the police station. He drove west instead, 2 hours, toward Cold Bend. Liam set the phone down on the counter and repeated every word to her. Her digital signature appeared on every transaction in that file. Not some of them. Not most of them. Every single one, confirmed, approved, dated, and time-stamped, $41 million. Olivia stood perfectly still for a long time, and then she did the one thing only an auditor would do in a moment like that. She began to calculate. She reached the number before he did. She said 18 years. She said that for a charge like that, with that amount of money, with her role as the person who certified the sanctions rather than merely carried them out, with no prior record and partial cooperation, it would be approximately 18 years. Then she spoke the second sentence in that same level voice, and it was the sentence that made Terry Kovacs turn his face away. She said the baby would be born into the state foster care system. Liam Fiore sat on the counter stool and understood the worst thing that had ever happened in his life. And it wasn't the 9 days, it wasn't the $41 million, and it wasn't the name Constance Ward. He understood that he couldn't protect her. Everything he had, every 11-second phone call, every person he could wake at 3 o'clock in the morning, every lawyer, every connection in places the police couldn't reach, all of it could do only one thing in the situation, and that was make everything worse. Because she wasn't being charged alongside him. She was being charged through him. Everything he touched from that moment forward would automatically become evidence against her. His power was the very thing that would destroy her. He said he would take all of it. He said it quickly, like a man afraid he might change his mind. He said he would sign a statement declaring that the $41 million belonged to him, that he had directed every transaction, and that the auditor had only followed orders under duress. He said that with the right lawyer she would be cleared. He said the baby would have a mother. Olivia looked at him. Then she said no. She said, "Do you think I want my child to grow up knowing its father went to prison so it would never have to know what its mother signed?" She said, "I signed them, Liam. I sat in that room for 3 years, and I signed every page. No one held gun to my head. I was 24 years old. I didn't have a penny, and they paid me exactly what my mind was worth, and I said yes. That is the whole story. There is no version of this in which I am innocent." She said all of it without crying, her voice neither rising nor falling, both hands still resting on the counter, and that was what made it terrible. From the kitchen, Rosalind Hartnett spoke one sentence. She said, "Good. Then you are the only person in this room today who has told the truth." The bell above the door rang. At some point, Terry had unlocked it again, and he had just gone out to his car and returned with a 3-year-old girl in a red coat in his arms. He said the babysitter was sick. He said he was sorry. She would only sit for a little while. Sonia slipped down from her father's arms and climbed onto the counter stool beside the man in the black wool coat on all fours, the way children climbed onto everything. She pulled a coloring page folded into quarters from her coat pocket. She opened it, smoothed it flat on the counter, then pushed it toward him. Liam Fiore looked at the paper. He had never held a child in his life. He sat as still as stone, both hands resting on the counter, with absolutely no idea what he was supposed to do with it. Sonia watched him expectantly. Then she sighed the way an adult sighed at someone who was slow to understand and said, "You're supposed to put it on the refrigerator." Liam said all right. He said it very softly. The girl nodded in satisfaction, climbed down from the stool, and went to find her father. From the kitchen, Rosalind Hartnett stood watching. 14 years. For 14 years, she had waited to see that face change, and it had just changed because of a coloring page inside a diner filled with broken glass. Then she wiped her hands on her apron and walked out. She said, "Terry, take the little girl to her grandmother's house in Allentown. Right now, stay there tonight." She offered no explanation. Terry Kovacs looked at her for exactly 1 second, then removed his apron, lifted his daughter into his arms, and left. He didn't ask a single question. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, an old pickup truck pulled up in front of the diner, and an elderly man stepped out and stood beyond the broken doorway without entering. He removed his cap first. Rosalind Hartnett looked at him through the empty space where the glass had been, and she recognized him before he had time to say his name, not by his face, but by the way he stood, the posture of a man who had spent 40 years waiting for someone to give him permission to step inside. She said he had once worked at the pier. Otto Brennan nodded. She told him to come in. He told them everything in 4 minutes. He told them what Freddie had bragged about in his panic that morning. Constance Ward was Frederick Pell's maternal aunt. Every dollar used to build Pell and Locke had come from her. And the diner, the $3,000 a month, had never been an extortion scheme at all. Liam sat without moving. Then Rosalind Hartnett rose. She walked into the kitchen. She reached for the hook above the stove and took down the cast-iron skillet. And for 1.5 seconds, all 3 men in that room thought the same wrong thing. She didn't hold it as though she intended to strike anyone. She turned it over, set it on the stove, and slipped one fingernail into a seam along the false bottom, a seam no one would ever notice unless they already knew it was there. The panel opened. Inside was a small leather-bound notebook, no larger than her hand and no thicker than a knuckle. She placed it on the counter in front of her son. Liam opened it. The handwriting was the same handwriting he had seen on thousands of pages throughout his life. During the final 4 years of his life, Wendell Fiore had recorded everything, every transaction. Dates, amounts, receiving companies, and the companies hidden behind those companies. He had traced it 10 years before Olivia Vane did, and he had no computer, no server access, nothing but a pen, a good memory, and 40 years of knowing how everything in that city truly worked. He knew, from the very first payment, and he did nothing. Not one phone call, not one meeting, not one word to anyone, not even his wife, not even his son. The final page bore a date, and Liam had to look at it twice, 3 weeks before his father died. There were only 3 sentences on that page. It said she gave 20 years to this thing, and not once did I invite her to sit down. It said if she takes anything from it, then it is what I owe her. Then there were 2 initials. Liam Fiore read it 3 times. Then he said he knew for 4 years, and he left it inside a frying pan. Rosalind said he wasn't hiding it from you, Liam. He was hiding it from himself. There is only one debt in this world that gathers interest whether a person admits it or not. It isn't money. Money can always be repaid. The respect we owe someone and never give them, that grows every day, and it never sends us a bill until the day it takes everything. Olivia was the first to name the problem. She picked up the notebook, turned through the pages, and said this will catch her. Then she set it down. She said, but it won't clear me. The notebook proved Constance Ward had stolen the money. The USB drive proved Constance Ward had stolen the money. Neither one proved that the person who signed off on every transaction had been coerced. Because she hadn't been coerced. There was only one thing that could undo her signatures, and that was Constance Ward admitting in her own words that she constructed the entire scheme. Liam made a phone call. He told the person on the other end that he agreed. Pier number 9, 9 o'clock that night, the Eastern Container Warehouse. He would bring the auditor and the drive. He ended the call and explained the plan, and it was very simple. He would go there with a recording device and let her talk. Olivia said she was going with him. Liam said no. He said it immediately, without thought, the way a person slammed a door shut. Then Rosalind Hartnett said the one thing no one in that room expected. She said, let her go. She said, I sat at home for 20 years, while the men in this family went out and did things they claimed were meant to protect me. Then she looked around her ruined diner, at the broken chair in the corner, the shattered window, and the coffee-stained apron still tied around her waist. She said, look at what it protected. Liam looked at her for a very long time. Then he nodded, 7 o'clock in the evening. Darkness had fully settled, and the cold was the particular kind of cold December brought to western Pennsylvania, dry and sharp and without wind. Olivia stood on the back porch of the diner, wearing the coat she had worn for 6 months, its inner lining now cut open, the ugly stitches exposed and empty. He came outside and stopped 2 steps away from her. Neither of them spoke for a long while. Then she said, you left without a single word. He said, I sat in my car outside your building for 4 hours. She turned her head and looked at him. She asked why he hadn't come upstairs. He didn't answer immediately. He looked across the dirt lot behind the diner, toward the trash cans and an old car no one used, and when he spoke, his voice was still that ordinary voice, only much slower now. The way people spoke when they had to pull every word from somewhere very deep inside themselves. He said, because I knew exactly what I would do if I went upstairs. He said, I would keep you, and I know what keeping a person looks like. He said, my father kept my mother for 20 years and called it marriage, and after he died, it took her 14 years just to learn how to breathe again. He said, I only have one way of being, Olivia. I own everything. It is the only way I have ever known to keep anything in my life. He said, I sat in that car at 4 o'clock in the morning and looked up at your window. And I understood that if I walked up those stairs, then 14 years from now, you would be a 60-year-old woman running a diner in a town no one had ever heard of, trying to remember who you had been before me. He finished speaking. He didn't look at her. He had prepared himself for her to understand, or for her to be angry, but he hadn't prepared himself for what came next. Olivia said, so you decided for me. She said, "You looked up at my window and made the choices for both of us." Then she said, "Liam, that is exactly the same thing. That is what it means to own another person. You simply did it from the parking lot." Liam Fior stood frozen. In 14 years, no one had ever said anything to him that he hadn't predicted at least 2 steps in advance, and he had just heard a sentence he had never considered in his life. And the worst part was that he knew immediately that it was true. For 7 months he had told himself a story about sacrifice, and she had turned it over in 4 seconds, and on the underside was the very thing he had believed he was trying to avoid. She continued, more gently. She said, "I don't need you to save me from you. I need you to ask me." He still said nothing. She stepped closer. She took his right wrist, the hand that had closed around another man's wrist that morning without needing to tighten, and placed it against her belly. He didn't pull away. 3 seconds passed, then the baby kicked. Liam Fior didn't move. He stood there for a very long time, longer than necessary, far longer than anyone needed to feel a single kick, and both his hands, the one resting on Nelly and the one hanging at his side, were trembling. The man who could bankrupt a $42 million company with 3 words spoken into a telephone stood in the darkness behind a diner in Coldwater Bend and couldn't keep his hands still. Then he said, "I don't know how to do this." He said it very softly, almost without sound, and it was the truest thing he had said to anyone since his father died. Olivia said, "No one does." She said that isn't the same as not trying. Inside, beyond the kitchen window, Rosalind Hartnett stood watching them. She had been there for nearly 2 minutes. She didn't step outside. She didn't tap on the glass. She only reached up and turned off the kitchen light, allowing the back porch to disappear completely into darkness, giving the 2 people outside another 10 minutes when no one could see them. And then she went inside, sat down in the dark, and waited. 9 o'clock at night. It was raining in Philadelphia, the kind of December rain that didn't fall so much as hang in the air and cling to everything. The Eastern Container Warehouse at Pier No. 9 was as large as a football field, with high-pressure lights suspended overhead, casting separate pools of yellow light onto the ground, and darkness filling the spaces between them. Constance Ward arrived first. She came in an unremarkable car, and she stepped out wearing a long gray coat and shoes unsuited for wet concrete, and she didn't appear troubled by it. Frederick Pell followed half a step behind her. With them were 6 men in suits, and this was the sort of detail someone's own watching a movie might overlook, but someone who lived in that world wouldn't. They weren't thugs. They were licensed private security officers with liability insurance, names listed in the state registry, and jobs with a company that had a website and a human resources department. On paper, everything taking place in that warehouse that night was legal. Liam Fiore arrived at 9:02. He came alone, or so it appeared. Olivia sat in the car about 220 yards away, the lights off, beyond the illuminated area. He walked into the center of the warehouse and stopped, and Constance Ward smiled at him with the smile of an aunt greeting her nephew. Then she spoke her first sentence, and it destroyed his entire plan in 8 seconds. She said, "You think I didn't scan you?" She said, "Your phone has been dead since you passed through the gate, as my detector scans for active RF transmissions and cellular signals." She pointed toward the car, confident that no live transmissions could escape her perimeter. Liam didn't move, but something inside his chest dropped, because she didn't merely know he had brought a recorder. She knew Olivia was there. She had known before he ever left Coldwater Bend. She said, "How many years do you think I have been doing this, sweetheart?" Frederick Pell opened a briefcase, removed a thick stack of papers, and placed it on top of a shipping container, and Liam looked down and for 3 seconds didn't understand what he was seeing. It wasn't a statement. It wasn't a plea agreement. It was a transfer file. Everything. Shares, assets, contracts, permits, everything bearing the Fiore name in the state of Pennsylvania. He looked up, and Constance Ward said the one thing no one in this story had ever considered. She said, "I never intended to send you to prison." She allowed the distance between them for 3 seconds. Then she said, "Prison would turn you into a legend, sweetheart. Every man in this city would tell stories about you for 30 years. They would tell one another that it took the federal government $41 million to bring Liam Fiore. No," she said, "you are going to live. You will wake up every morning, every day, with nothing at all, in a town no one has ever heard of, and you will watch me run what your father built." She said, "That was the thing your father never understood. He thought a person had to bury someone. You don't. You only have to let them live and watch. The federal case wasn't the sentence. It had never been the sentence. It was leverage, and now she placed it on the scale before him, calmly, almost tenderly. Sign, and she would withdraw it, and the auditor's name would never be mentioned. Refuse, and the case would continue. And in 9 days, there would be an indictment bearing Olivia Vane's name, 18 years, and the baby born into the state foster care system. She said the words 18 years in exactly the same voice she had used to ask about his mother. Liam Fiore stood there for a very long time. Rain tapped against the high metal roof above them. He said nothing. He didn't bargain. He didn't threaten her in return. In 14 years, he had never entered a room without having at least 3 moves available to him. And now he stood in the middle of a warehouse calculating. And he calculated that there were none. Not because he wasn't intelligent enough. Because she was right. He looked down at the papers. Then he held out his hand, and Frederick Pell gave him a pen, and Freddie smiled, the smile he had waited all day to wear. Liam Fiore took the pen. He turned to the final page, and he lowered the tip toward the paper. The tip of the pen hadn't made a single mark when a voice came from between 2 rows of shipping containers. Otto Brennan stepped into the light. He had been with Freddie all evening, sitting in the back seat, and no one had paid attention to a 62-year-old man in a faded baseball cap, because no one had paid attention to him in 20 years. He didn't walk toward Constance Ward. He walked toward the 6 men in suits, and he spoke to them. He said, "I was unloading cargo at this pier before any of you were born." He said, "That woman just told then a man wants him to stay alive so he can watch." Then he paused and looked at each of them in turn. He said, "Where do you think you'll be standing once she has that chair?" No one struck anyone. No one drew anything. 3 of the 6 men stood still for 2 seconds. Then the one nearest the door took a step backward. Then he turned and walked out. 2 more followed him. They didn't run. They simply walked past Otto through the pool of light out into the rain, and the sound of their shoes against the wet concrete was the only sound in that warehouse for 10 seconds. It was the one thing money could never buy, and Constance Ward had spent 20 years proving she didn't need it. When people had been afraid for long enough, all it took was one person saying aloud that they were allowed to leave. Then Olivia Vane stepped into the light. She came from the direction of the door, moving slowly, one hand the underside of her belly, the way women 6 months pregnant walked across uneven ground. Her other hand was empty. Constance Ward looked at her and said she didn't have a recording device. She said, "I would know." Olivia said, "You're right. I don't have an active transmitter." Then she reached into her coat pocket, took out a small, professional digital audio recorder, and held it up. Its screen was glowing, showing a continuous recording of 41 minutes. She said, "This is a military-grade offline recorder, Constance. It doesn't emit a single RF signal or cellular wave for your scanners to catch. I started recording 41 minutes ago, and the local storage is fully encrypted. 10 minutes before I walked in, I registered a scheduled digital backup trigger via my car's automated outbound network. The encrypted file was packaged and uploaded directly to a secure cloud server managed by the federal prosecutor. Maribel Quintero has received the finalized cloud stream and has been processing your confession for the past 10 minutes. The entire confession is already on her desk. It was only a woman making a phone call. The past 41 minutes had been heard. All of it. The fact that Frederick Pell was her nephew. The fact that the federal case was merely leverage. The coerced transfer. The sentence about leaving a man alive so he could watch. Constance Ward lost her composure. It was the first time in this entire story, and it lasted for exactly 1 sentence. She said, "She's the auditor. She'll go to prison too." Olivia said, "I know." She said, "I gave her my statement before I drove here. All 3 years. Every page I signed. She has my complete testimony and my attorney's phone number." Liam Fiore turned his head and looked at her, and he understood. She had set fire to her own life to save him, and she had done it 41 minutes earlier, alone, inside a dark car, without asking him a single question. He said her name, once, only once, and the ordinary voice he had preserved for 14 years broke apart in the middle of it. Then came the sirens. Not one vehicle. Many, approaching from 2 directions, and blue and red light began sweeping across the walls of the containers. Constance Ward didn't run. She didn't look toward the door. She remained exactly where she was in the pool of yellow light, her arms hanging at her sides, and she looked at Liam Fiore. and she spoke her final sentence in a voice that was almost gentle. She said, 20 years, Liam. Not one of you ever invited me to sit down. Frederick Pell ran. He turned and lunged toward the side door, and Otto Brennan was standing there. Otto didn't raise his hands. He didn't block him with anything. He simply stood across the doorway, a 62-year-old man wearing a faded cap, and said, "Don't." Frederick Pell stopped 3 feet from him and stood there breathing hard, and he didn't take another step. Then everything became loud and bright, and there were people everywhere in windbreakers marked with yellow lettering, and amid all of it, in the center of that pool of light, Olivia Vane collapsed. She didn't cry out. She only braced one hand against the wet concrete and sank down, and Liam turned and saw her face. 6.5 months, 13 weeks too early. He carried her. The man who had lost his entire empire in 1 minute bent down, slipped both arms beneath her, and lifted her from the wet concrete. He didn't call for anyone. There were 30 people inside that warehouse by then. Federal agents, vehicles, radios, and he didn't say a word to any of them. He gave no orders. For 14 years, everything Liam Fior had ever done had been carried out by someone else's hands, and now he walked through the pool of light and out into the rain, opened the car door with his elbow, and for the first time in his life, he did something with his own 2 hands. He drove. Delaware Avenue was wet and black, and the lights reflected across the pavement in long streaks. She lay in the back seat. At the second red light, he stopped for 3 seconds, then looked into the rearview mirror and drove through it. Liam Fior, who hadn't received a single traffic ticket in 14 years because everything in his life had always been calculated, ran a red light on Delaware Avenue at 10 o'clock at night in the rain. She said something. He couldn't hear her clearly. She said it again. She said, "If I don't wake up." He said, "You will wake up." Then he said he didn't know how to beg. He said, "I'm begging now." The hospital. The emergency room doors opened, and 4 people in blue scrubs came out and took her from his arms, and the doors closed in front of him, and he stood there with both hands still holding the shape of a person who was no longer in them. A hallway, fluorescent lights, orange plastic chairs bolted to the wall, a vending machine humming. 60 minutes later, Rosalind Hartnett walked through the doors. She was still wearing her apron. The coffee stain from that morning was still there. She had driven for 60 minutes, and she hadn't changed her clothes, hadn't removed the apron, hadn't done anything except pick up her keys and leave. She came to stand beside him, and Liam Fior, 37 years old, sat down on the hospital hallway floor and cried. He didn't hold it back. He didn't turn his face away. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall and cried the way a person cried when something that had been frozen inside him for 14 years finally shattered, and a nurse walked past, looked at him, and kept going because she had seen this 1,000 times before. Rosalind sat down beside him on the floor, 61 years old, wearing a dirty apron on the hospital tile. She said nothing. She only raised one hand and placed it on his head, and she kept it there, exactly as she had 30 years earlier. She had waited 14 years to see that face change. She had never once wanted to see it change like this. The baby lived, 3 pounds, 1 ounce, a girl. They placed her in an incubator before Olivia regained consciousness, and they said 6 weeks, perhaps 8, and they used words no one in that hallway fully understood. Liam saw his daughter for the first time through a layer of glass. She was so small that his mind refused to accept that she was a human being. There was a round opening in the side of the incubator, and the nurse told him he could put 1 finger through it. He couldn't hold her. He couldn't touch her much. 1 finger. He slipped his index finger inside, and left beside a hand no larger than the tip of his thumb, and he stood that way for 40 minutes. The man who could bankrupt a $42 million company with 3 words spoken into a telephone couldn't do anything to help a creature who weighed 3 pounds. There was no call he could make. No amount of money he could spend, no one he could command. All he could do was stand there, keep 1 finger still, and wait. Olivia woke at 4 o'clock in the morning. Rosalind sat beside the bed. Olivia opened her eyes, looked at the ceiling, and the first thing she said wasn't about the baby. She asked whether Constance had confessed. Rosalind Hartnett looked at her for 2 seconds. Then she laughed. It was the first laughter in this entire story, and it burst from the mouth of a woman in a dirty apron inside a hospital room at 4 o'clock in the morning, and she laughed so hard that she had to cover her face with 1 hand. And Olivia lay there without an understanding and began to laugh with her. On the third day, Maribel Quintero came. She brought no one with her, she brought no handcuffs. She pulled a chair beside the bed, sat down, and placed a sheet of paper on the meal table. She said, "You are going to need a lawyer for this," then she said. "But first, I want you to know one thing." She said, "You called me. No one arrested you." Constance Ward was indicted on charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and extortion. She pleaded not guilty. She went to trial, and she lost, and her sentence was 22 years. Throughout trial, which lasted an entire winter, she didn't apologize to anyone, not even to the 61-year-old woman sitting in the back row. Frederick Pell testified in exchange for a reduced sentence and received 7 years. Otto Brennan walked into the federal office in Philadelphia on his own 6 days after that night and told them everything. When they asked him why, he said, "I watched a 61-year-old woman fall to the floor of her own diner, and I stood there and did nothing. At my age, there aren't many chances left to choose again." He received 3 years of probation. Olivia Vane wasn't acquitted. She pleaded guilty. Her sentence was 18 months of probation, 2,000 hours of community service, and the permanent revocation of her license to practice accounting in the state of Pennsylvania. She lost that profession forever, the only thing she had ever truly been good at. People often think forgiveness means having everything returned to you. It doesn't. Forgiveness only means you're allowed to keep moving forward, carrying exactly what you have done. Liam Fiore didn't go to prison because there was no evidence against him. But over 14 months, he voluntarily dissolved oral lungs and surrendered the entire $41 million. He kept exactly 3 things: 1 legitimate transportation company, the old house, and the permit at Pier Number 9. The same permit he had once used to bankrupt a man with 3 words, which he transferred to a cooperative owned by the dock workers themselves. Otto Brennan received a share. Liam didn't escape responsibility cheaply. He chose to lose everything. It took him 4 months to repair the chair. He learned wood joinery from a 70-year-old carpenter in Coldwater Bend who charged him $40 a session and had no idea who he was. And Liam ruined 3 legs before he managed to make the 4th one properly. On the day he placed the chair back in the corner of the diner, Rosalind Hartnett looked at it for a long time. Then she said no. That place wasn't being saved for anyone anymore, and she sat down in that chair herself, for the first time in 14 years. Some chairs are left empty out of respect, and some are left empty only because we haven't yet found the courage to sit down inside our own lives. The cast iron skillet was hung back on its hook, and from that day forward, it fried eggs every morning like an ordinary skillet. Rosalind burned the notebook in the sink. She told her son, "Your father owed someone a seat at the table. Don't ever owe anyone that again." The USB drive remained in evidence. After the trial, Maribel Quintero sent Olivia an envelope, and inside wasn't the drive, but a copy of the job application she had submitted to Fiore Holdings when she was 24, with a handwritten line beneath it. "You were 24 years old, and you had no one in the world. That doesn't erase anything. Explains a great deal. Don't let it become a whole story." They didn't marry right away. Liam rented an apartment 3 blocks from the diner and didn't move in with Olivia, because she told him, "You have to learn how to love me without owning me, and that isn't a 1-week course." He came for breakfast every day. He washed dishes. The man who had once fired a warehouse manager of 22 years through an email sent at 6:04 in the morning became a regular at his mother's diner, and Sonia Kovac, 4 years old, called him Uncle Black Coffee. 11 months later, after the diner had closed, Olivia was wiping down the tables when he asked her to marry him. She said, "Ask me again when you have nothing left to offer me except yourself." He said, "I don't have anything else left, Olivia. That is exactly the problem." And she laughed. It was the first time in his life he heard her laugh. The baby was named Wendy Rosalind Fiore. Rosalind chose the name herself, she said, "so that every time I call her name, I will remember that good people can still be wrong, and that isn't a reason to stop loving them." Olivia never worked as an accountant again. She bought the diner from Rosalind when Rosalind was 66, and she could still calculate the checks for 14 tables in her head without a machine, because people could take away a person's license, but they couldn't take away what lived inside that person's mind. Rosalind Hartnett died at the age of 74, in her sleep, in the small room above the diner. Half the town came to her funeral. Not one of them knew she had once been Wendell Fiore's wife. Years later, when Wendy was 12, she asked what her grandmother had done before opening the diner. Olivia said, "She waited. For a very long time. Then she stopped waiting. The chair remained in the corner of the diner. Someone sat in it, every day. $41 million, once 22 years in prison. A family broken apart for 14 years. And it all began with a debt no one thought was a debt: respect. We often believe we have been kind to some sons simply because we have never harmed them. But there is a vast distance between not hurting a person and truly seeing them. Respect is the only debt that gathers interest every day without ever sending a bill, until the day it takes everything. If this story touched you, please press the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel so that every day we can listen together to meaningful stories like this one. And we would like to know how this story made you feel. In your own life, is there someone standing behind a door, waiting for you to invite them to sit down? Please leave a comment, because we read every single one and sincerely want to hear what is in your heart. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. May you and your family always enjoy good health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity every day. Goodbye, and we will see you again in the next video.